This is a small town in southwest Wales, 12 miles from Carmarthen. It's the sort of place you could drive through without knowing you're here. But it's a place that will be remembered for all time, because 30-odd years ago, a poet from Swansea came to live here. He was so inspired by the place and by its people that he wrote a small play about it. This is Laugharne. The play was Under Milk Wood, and the poet, Marlais Thomas. The Marlais Thomas Trail begins in Swansea on the 27th of October, 1914.
I was born in a large Welsh industrial town at the beginning of the Great War. An ugly, lovely town, or so it was and is to me, crawling, sprawling, slummed, unplanned jerry-villared and smug suburbed by the side of a long and splendid curving shore.
Dillon was born in this house, number 5 Cwmdonkin Drive, in the heart of his ugly, lovely town. It was an ordinary house in an extraordinary location. The one side had the whole sweep of the Swansea town and bay, but the other held even greater childhood riches.
That Cwmdonkin Park was a world within the world of the sea town. We would explore it, armed and desperate from end to end.
This park set Dillon's imagination free.
That park grew up with me. That small world widened as I learned its secrets and boundaries, as I discovered new refuges and ambushes in its woods and jungles, hidden homes and lairs for the multitudes of imagination, for cowboys and Indians, and the tall, terrible half-people who rode on nightmares through my bedroom.
The Swansea landscape and Cwmdonkin Park. Dillon would return to this childhood world time and again, mining it for poetic and prose material. Dillon spent his early years at the Dame School in Mirador Crescent. It was
firm and kind and smelling of galoshes.
He was never a model pupil, and his instinct for debunking authority continued when he entered the Swansea Grammar School. The composer Daniel Jones had been a close friend of Dillon since his school days.
Well, he was a most unorthodox schoolboy in the sense that I don't think any teacher was particularly pleased with his activities in class when he did turn up. And he had a certain freedom in the school because his father was the senior English master, and he was rather a frightening person in his quiet way. The masters were afraid of him, and Dillon received no punishments for the occasions when he was absent and misbehaved himself.
Dillon's only academic achievement at school was to have edited the school magazine. He told a story of how, on leaving school early one day, he was stopped by the headmaster. "Where are you going?" "Home to write poetry," replied Dillon. "Well, don't get caught then," said the headmaster. Throughout this childhood time in Swansea, Dillon's energies poured into his surroundings, into adventures and explorations, much more than into his education. And he was discovering more and more in his town.
There was another world where, with my friends, I used to dawdle on half-holidays along the bent and Devon-facing seashore, hoping for gold watches, or the skull of a sheep, or a message in a bottle to be washed up with the tide. Or we took a tram that shook like an iron jelly down to the gaunt pier, there to clamber under the pier, hanging perilously onto its skeleton legs, or to run along to the end, where patient men with the seaward eyes of the dockside unemployed, capped and mufflered, dangling from their mouths pipes that had long gone out, angled over the edge for unpleasant-tasting fish.
Down at the Mumbles, Dillon's childhood horizons were widening. His drinking, which became so celebrated in later life, most certainly began as part of the young poet's challenge to a world that sought to limit him. School never contained Dillon, and he left the Swansea Grammar School at the age of 16 without having passed any major examinations. His stated ambition was to be a poet as good as Keats, if not better. Though Dillon was writing at this time, recognition was still some years away. Forced into regular employment for the first and only time in his life, he joined the South Wales Daily Post. 1930 Swansea was a town of contrasts. Massive unemployment and a deepening depression had hit the area. 28,000 people were unemployed. But no depression could dim the poet's imagination, for Dillon's stimulation came from forces that no economic depression could touch. It came from the splendor of Mumbles and Gower.
I often go down in the mornings to the farthest point of Gower, the village of Roistering, and stay there till evening. The bay is the wildest, bleakest, and barrenest I know.
From the great rock of the Worm's Head.
Instead of becoming small on the great rock, poised between sky and sea, I felt myself the size of a breathing building. I said, "Why don't we live here always? Always and always! Build a bloody house and live like bloody kings!"
And all the time, Dillon was fast building his kingdom. One friend since his Swansea days was broadcaster Winford Vaughan Thomas.
It was about this time that Dillon suddenly took an interest in acting, and he was a marvellous actor. But of course we didn't know it at the time. When he joined Swansea Little Theatre, we thought we'll give him a walk-on part. The play, The Merchant of Venice, and it's hard to believe now, but I was Lorenzo, and Dillon was going to be the messenger from Belmont. And I delivered my great speech, with what I thought was tremendous aplomb. "Sit, Jessica, see how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold." And then eventually I cue over to Dillon. "Messenger from Belmont, soft, who comes so fast in silence of the night?" A word to that effect. Nobody came at any speed at all. Dillon was down below here, having a well-deserved couple of quickies in the Mermaid Bar. I had no option. "Sit again, Jessica," I said desperately. "Once more, see how the floor of heaven." And then, in despair, I gave the cue. This time Dillon came on. He said, "My lord, a messenger from Belmont." And I couldn't resist. I said, "About time too." But Dillon revealed himself as a marvellous actor. It was, I think, at the Little Theatre that he first realised he could project his voice, that wonderful voice that made his fortune in America. Nobody ever heard Dillon, or somebody like Dillon, reading poetry like that before. He was recorded, and those discs, by a curious irony, are the best money spinners for the literary estate. I'm one of the literary executors, and thank heavens we've got records still going around in America, and they've educated his children, they've kept his widow in happiness, and Dillon, after death, there he is, reading away that wonderful voice which I maintain began at the Swansea Little Theatre.
His intellectual life was being stimulated by the companionship of several other contemporaries in Swansea, all similarly destined for considerable artistic achievement. Alfred Janes in painting, Daniel Jones in music, and Vernon Watkins in poetry. He had found a literary mentor in Swansea, a left-wing socialist grocer called Bert Trick, to whom Dillon read his early poetry and who recognized from the first his extraordinary genius. And running through it all, above it all, he had Swansea too.
Never was there such a town, I thought, for the smell of fish and chips on Saturday nights, for the Saturday afternoon cinema matinees where we shouted and hissed our threepences away.
Dillon's Swansea of the 30s worked its magic into his work. Daniel Jones had written poetry with the young Dillon. What had made Dillon a poet?
His father, of course, was a literary man, and the genes were in the family, and Dillon was born a poet. But then the environment was favorable. When he grew up in a house full of books, his father, with a beautiful speaking voice, who encouraged him, no doubt, to read. And then, I must add this, that he met me, and we associated in literature ourselves, commonly. And that was a period for him of great productivity. This really is one of the most remarkable things about any poet's career I know. The exact dates are April 1930 to August 1933. During that period, he wrote a tremendous number of poems, about 140, something like that.
3/4 of Dillon's poetry was written between the age of 16 and 20. But his childhood was fast being left behind, and so was Swansea. And he never settled there again for any length of time. In 1934, the 20-year-old poet left his Swansea home for smoky London. He loved the bohemian world of writers and artists, but time after time, he was drawn back to Wales. Vital to an understanding of the life and personality of Dylan Thomas is the tremendous importance of his surroundings, his environment for his work, an importance that would work all his adult life on the style and content of his poetry and prose. But one should remember that this environment had also to be specific. Most particularly, it had to include the landscape of Wales. Though he made several attempts to live elsewhere, the real Dylan Thomas trail never strayed far from Swansea and was always within southwest Wales, a trail that had become established in his childhood. His early childhood holidays were spent to the west of Swansea on his aunt's Carmarthenshire farm of Fern Hill. With Cumdonkin Park, it was the setting that was to provide some of his richest poetic themes.
There was nowhere like that farmyard in all the slapdash country. Nowhere so poor and grand and dirty as that square of mud and rubbish and bad wood and falling stone, where a bucket full of old and bedraggled hens scratched and laid small eggs.
This setting was also to produce one of his greatest poems, Fern Hill. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days. That time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising. Nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. He frequently went further west, to the estuary village of Llansteffan, spending many holidays in relatives' adjoining cottages at Blaencwm. And occasionally he would cross that estuary to the strangest town in Wales.
I am spending Whitsun in the strangest town in Wales. It has a population of 400, has a town hall, a castle and a portreeve. The people speak with a broad English accent, although on all sides they are surrounded by hundreds of miles of Welsh country. The neutral sea lies at the foot of the town, and Richard Hughes writes his cosmopolitan stories in the castle. It is called Laugharne.
There are two great creative periods in Dylan Thomas's work. The first, in his childhood and adolescence, took place in Swansea. The second, in his adult life, took place here in Laugharne. Laugharne is a history that can be traced back to the 12th century, when its castle was built by the great Welsh prince, Rhys ap Gruffydd. In 1307, it was granted an ancient charter, and the corporation of the town is still governed by that charter. It's a tiny pocket of individuality, hidden among the Carmarthenshire hills, and it fitted Dylan like a glove. Dylan first lived in a fisherman's cottage in Gosport Street with his new wife, Caitlin McNamara, a few years after leaving Swansea in 1938.
I warn you that our cottage is poky and ugly. 4 rooms like stained boxes and a workman's and a fisherman's row with a garden leading down to mud and sea, that our living and cooking is rough, that you bathe or go dirty. You will find my wife extremely nice. Me small, argumentative, good-tempered, lazy, fumbling, boozy as possible. Lower middle class in attitude and reaction. A dirty tongue, a silly young man.
There's been much speculation as to whether Dellen was a religious poet. Though he wrote about God, it was life that he worshipped, and the world and the people around him. Dellen's domestic arrangements were initially handled by the novelist Richard Hughes, author of A High Wind in Jamaica, who with his wife lived in this Georgian house abutting onto the ruins of Laugharne Castle. But within a few months of their arrival in Laugharne, the Hugheses had arranged for Dellen and Catelyn to move to a larger house behind the castle. Friends began to pour into Laugharne to visit the newly married couple. Augustus John and Fred James became regular visitors. Others followed: Vernon Watkins, Mervyn Levy, and John Davenport. Seaview in the summer and autumn of 1938 was a happy time for Dellen. He was working hard and began to throw himself into the quirky, idiosyncratic social life of Laugharne. What would he have achieved had he then been allowed to settle? No one will know. For the Second World War was declared less than 1 year after Dellen first arrived in Laugharne, and though he was pronounced unfit for military service, the war forced Dellen away again and again from the Welsh landscape he needed so much. And much of Dellen's energy over the next few years was spent in several determined efforts to get back. He lived near Newquay in Cardiganshire in 1944, just a mile from the town, the harbour, and the fishing boats. Catelyn also found them a house further inland near Laugharne a year earlier. Throughout this time, both made several unsuccessful attempts to find accommodation in their adopted Laugharne. But why should Laugharne have become so important? I mean, why here? The answer, like so many, lies in Dellen's past. A major clue is contained in a letter he wrote to Daniel Jones.
We must, when our affairs are settled, when music and poetry are arranged in that we can still live, love and drink beer, go back to Uplands or Sketty, and found there for good and all a permanent colony, living there until we are old gentlemen, with occasional visits to London and Paris. We shall lead the lives of small-town anti-society. So, Jones and Thomas, that well-known firm of family provisioners, shall not move out of their old town. So be it.
From this point on, his poetic work began more and more to celebrate his past. And it is possible that one dominant and driving purpose for the rest of Dellen's life was his attempt to recreate the conditions of his Swansea past here in his adult life in Laugharne. In 1949, the actress Margaret Taylor bought Dellen the boathouse, his most famous and permanent home in Laugharne. It overlooks the estuary, taking in views of the sands at Pendine, the peninsula of Llanstefan, Buryport, the town of Laugharne, and the promontory of Sir John's Hill. Dellen made arrangements for his parents to move into a rented house in Laugharne's main street, opposite Dellen's favourite haunt, Brown's Hotel. He found many new friends in Laugharne. In Richard Hughes and others, he found the early mentors he had found in the Swansea socialist, Bert Trick. And as with a view from his small bedroom in Cumdonkin Drive, the boathouse had the sea. The boathouse, the most famous of all Dellen's houses, lay at the end of this long, narrow lane that has since been christened Dellen's Walk. Dellen worked here in this hut, 50 yards from the boathouse, on Dellen's Walk itself. But Dellen didn't recreate these conditions of his past merely for a boyhood nostalgia. His real purpose became clear as once again his environment of the Laugharne sea, sands and estuary village worked its way into the fabric of his poetry and prose, as Swansea had done 30 years earlier.
Over Sir John's Hill, the hawk, on fire, hangs still. In a hoisted cloud, at drop of dusk, he pulls to his claws and gallows up the rays of his eyes the small birds of the bay, and the shrill child's play wars of the sparrows, and such who swan sing dusk in wrangling hedges. And blithely they squawk to fiery Tyburn over the wrestle of elms, until the noosed hawk crashes, and slowly the fishing, holy stalking heron in the river Towie below bows his tilted headstone.
And throughout the whole of this second great creative period in Laugharne, Dillon was working on his most famous commemoration of his surroundings, his dramatic work, Under Milkwood. The first hint of Dillon's plans for Under Milkwood came in the kitchen of Richard Hughes's house in 1939. What the people of Laugharne need is a play about themselves, he told Hughes, a play in which they act themselves. The genesis of the idea also went back to his early Swansea days. In 1933, he had told his old socialist friend, Bert Trick, about his wish to write a sort of Welsh Ulysses, a story encompassed within 24 hours. But Dillon was not ready to write Under Milkwood in 1933. He needed his experience over the next 15 years of living in different villages up and down West Wales to give him his wealth of local characters on which to draw. Many of the characters that appear in the play were plucked from this seaside village of Newquay in Cardiganshire, where Dillon and his family lived briefly in 1944. Some came from Llangain and Llanstefan. But the major, primary, dominant influence was Laugharne.
It is spring, moonless night in the small town, starless and Bible black. The cobble streets silent, and the hunched quarters and rabbit's wood limping invisible down to the slow, black, crow-black fishing boat bobbing sea. The houses are blind as moles, though moles see fine tonight in the snouting velvet dingles. Or blind as Captain Cat, there in the muffled middle by the pump and the town clock, the shops in mourning, the welfare hall in widow's weeds, and all the people of the lulled and dumbfound town are sleeping now.
As events turned out, of course, Under Milkwood was to be more than ultimate commemoration of Laugharne. It was to be the last work the poet ever wrote. He was driven by financial pressure to make his fourth American lecture tour in 3 years. Dillon's prodigious drinking, which had begun back in the Mermaid Hotel in the Mumbles in his teens, led to what seemed to many his inevitable fate. At 2 a.m. on November the 4th, 1953, he struggled out of his New York hotel bed. He returned to his bed after an hour and a half. He spoke just one sentence. "I've had 18 straight whiskies. I think that's the record." The next day, Dillon was transferred to St. Vincent's Hospital in a coma. His wife, Kathleen, was rushed from Laugharne to New York, arriving on November the 7th. But she was never to see Dillon conscious again. He died 2 days later, on November the 9th, 1953. In the memorable phrase, Dillon died of a massive insult to the brain. The Dillon Thomas Trail ended here in Laugharne, just 40 miles from where it had begun in Swansea. Though he travelled most of Britain, indeed most of the world, there is a sense in which the real Dillon Thomas never left this 40-mile path along southwest Wales. He could never live nor work away from here, and it was to here, at the end, that he was brought back to lie forever. But the adult in Dillon Thomas always connected back to the child. And there is a lane, like this lane, back in Swansea, at the back of Dillon's first school in Mirador Crescent, to which perhaps now it all returns.
The lane was always the place to tell your secrets. If you didn't have any, you invented them. Occasionally now, I dream that I am turning out of school into the lane of confidences, when I say to the boys of my class, "At last, I have a real secret." "What is it? What is it?" "I can fly." And when they do not believe me, I flap my arms and slowly leave the ground, only a few inches at first, then gaining air, until I fly, waving my cap level with the upper windows of the school, peering in, until the mistress at the piano screams and the metronome falls to the ground and stops. And there is no more time. And I fly over the trees and chimneys of my town, over the yellow seashore and the stone-chasing dogs, and the old men and the singing sea. The memories of childhood have no order and no end.